Marcus Thompson had always been the biggest kid in every room he entered. At 23 years old, he stood 6 feet 4 inches tall with shoulders that seemed to span doorways. His hands were the size of dinner plates, calloused from years of construction work and weekend bar fights. But it wasn't just his physical presence that made people step aside when he walked down the street in downtown Leeds. It was the cold, predatory look in his pale blue eyes that suggested violence was always just one wrong word away. The unemployment office on Briggate Street had become Marcus's second home over the past 8 months. Every Tuesday morning, he would lumber through the glass doors, his steel-toed boots echoing against the polished floor like thunder. The staff had learned to avoid eye contact, processing his paperwork with trembling hands while he loomed over their desks, breathing heavily through his nose like an agitated bull. Sarah Chen, a petite caseworker in her early 30s, had drawn the short straw of being Marcus's assigned counselor. She had tried everything to help him find work, but his reputation preceded him wherever he went. 3 different construction companies had fired him for starting fights with co-workers. A security firm had let him go after he put a fellow guard in the hospital over a parking space dispute. Even the local pub had banned him after he threw a man through their front window during what started as a friendly game of darts. On this particular gray Tuesday morning in November, Sarah noticed something different about Marcus. He seemed angrier than usual, if that was even possible. His jaw was clenched so tightly that she could see the muscles in his face twitching. His massive fists were balled up on his knees as he sat across from her desk, the cheap plastic chair groaning under his weight. "Marcus," Sarah began carefully, her voice barely above a whisper, "I found 3 potential job opportunities for you this week. There's a warehouse position in Hunslet, a construction job in Morley, and a security role at a shopping center in Henningley." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He was staring out the window at the street below, watching people hurry past in the cold November air. A group of teenagers was laughing loudly as they walked by, and Sarah saw Marcus's eyes narrow as he followed their movement. She had learned to recognize the signs. When Marcus got that particular look, someone was about to get hurt. "They're all the same," Marcus finally growled, his voice like gravel in a cement mixer. "Same dead-end jobs for dead-end people. You think I'm some kind of charity case that needs your pity?" Sarah's hands were shaking as she shuffled through the papers on her desk. She had dealt with difficult clients before, but there was something about Marcus that made her skin crawl. It was the way he looked at her sometimes, like he was calculating exactly how much force it would take to break her in half. "I'm just trying to help you find employment, Marcus. These are good opportunities with decent pay. The warehouse position even offers overtime and benefits." Marcus leaned forward suddenly, his massive frame casting a shadow across Sarah's desk. The smell of cigarettes and cheap aftershave filled her nostrils, making her stomach turn. "You want to help me? Then, find me something that pays what I'm worth. I'm not some minimum wage loser who's going to spend his life moving boxes around for rich people." The truth was, Marcus had grown up believing the world owed him something. His father had been a successful businessman who owned a chain of hardware stores across Yorkshire. Marcus had spent his childhood being told he was special, that he was destined for greatness simply because of who his family was. But, when his father died in a car accident when Marcus was 18, the family business had crumbled under a mountain of debt. The insurance money had gone to pay off creditors, leaving Marcus and his mother with nothing but a council flat in one of Leeds's rougher neighborhoods. That was when the anger had really started. Marcus couldn't accept that his privileged life was over. He couldn't handle being just another face in the crowd, another working-class kid with no prospects. So he had turned to violence as a way to maintain his sense of superiority. If he couldn't be successful, at least he could be feared. The pattern had started in his local pub, the King's Arms, where Marcus would pick fights with anyone who looked at him wrong. At first, it had been drunken brawls that ended with someone buying him a pint to avoid trouble. But, as his reputation grew, so did his appetite for violence. He started targeting people who were smaller than him, using his size advantage to humiliate and hurt anyone who dared to cross his path. The older residents of his neighborhood still talked about the night Marcus had beaten 3 university students unconscious outside a fish and chip shop. The boys had made the mistake of laughing too loudly as they walked past him on their way home from a night out. Marcus had followed them for 2 blocks before cornering them in an alley. When the police arrived, they found all 3 students in the hospital and Marcus calmly finishing his cigarette next to their unconscious bodies. That incident had earned him 6 months in prison, but it had only made him more dangerous when he got out. Prison had taught him how to fight more efficiently, how to hurt people in ways that wouldn't leave obvious evidence. He had learned which bones to break to cause maximum pain, which pressure points could drop a man in seconds, and how to time his attacks to avoid security cameras. Sarah was trying to end their meeting when Marcus suddenly stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Several other people in the office turned to look, their conversations dying away as they sensed the tension in the air. Marcus didn't seem to notice or care about the attention. His focus was entirely on Sarah, who was now pressed back against her chair as if she could somehow disappear into the fabric. "I think we're done here," Marcus said, his voice carrying a subtle threat that made Sarah's blood run cold. "And, next time you call me in for one of these little chats, make sure you have something better than warehouse work to offer me." As Marcus walked toward the exit, he deliberately bumped into an elderly man who was waiting in line at the reception desk. The collision sent the man stumbling backward, his walking stick clattering to the floor. Instead of apologizing, Marcus just stared down at him with a cold smile before continuing toward the door. "Excuse me, sir," called out James Morrison, a security guard who had been watching the interaction from his post near the entrance. "I think you should apologize to that gentleman." Marcus stopped dead in his tracks. Slowly, he turned around to face the security guard, his pale blue eyes scanning the man from head to toe. James was in his early 40s, about average height and build, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He was wearing the standard uniform of a private security company, complete with a radio clip to his shoulder and a name badge that identified him as a supervisor. What Marcus couldn't see, and what James would never volunteer unless specifically asked, was the small pin on his uniform collar that identified him as a former member of the Coldstream Guards, one of the most elite infantry regiments in the British Army. James had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq, earning commendations for bravery under fire and exceptional leadership in combat situations. But that was a chapter of his life he preferred to keep private, especially in his current role providing security for government buildings and public spaces. The unemployment office fell completely silent as Marcus began walking back toward James, his heavy footsteps echoing through the lobby like a countdown to disaster. Everyone could sense what was about to happen, but no one seemed able to move or speak. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion of violence. Marcus stopped just inches away from James, using his height advantage to loom over the smaller man. He could smell the guard's cologne and see the small scar on his left temple that spoke of old injuries. But what Marcus failed to notice was the way James's stance had subtly shifted, his weight balanced on the balls of his feet, his hands relaxed but ready to move at a moment's notice. "Did you just tell me what to do?" Marcus asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" James looked up at him calmly, his expression never changing. "I'm talking to someone who just knocked down an elderly man and walked away without apologizing. That's all I need to know." The room was so quiet that people could hear the traffic outside on Briggate Street. Sarah was frozen at her desk, her hand hovering over the phone as she tried to decide whether to call for help. The elderly man was still on the ground, too shocked to get up, his walking stick just out of reach. Marcus's face was turning red with anger. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who was smaller than him. In his world, might made right, and anyone who couldn't back up their words with their fists deserved whatever they got. The fact that this security guard was standing up to him felt like a personal insult that demanded immediate retribution. "You've made a big mistake," Marcus whispered, his breath hot against James's face. "I'm going to enjoy teaching you some manners." What happened next would be talked about in Leeds for months afterward. It would be dissected and analyzed by everyone from local police officers to military veterans who recognized the precision and efficiency of what they witnessed. But, in that moment, as Marcus drew back his massive fist to deliver what he expected to be a devastating blow, time seemed to slow down for everyone watching. James moved with a speed and fluidity that seemed impossible for a man in his 40s. As Marcus's punch came toward his face, James stepped slightly to the side, grabbed the bigger man's wrist, and used his own momentum against him. Before Marcus knew what was happening, he was flying through the air, his 250-pound frame crashing into a row of plastic chairs with a sound like thunder. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus lay among the scattered chairs, stunned and, gasping for breath, unable to comprehend what had just happened to him. He had never been thrown around like that before, never felt so completely helpless and out of control. The humiliation was almost worse than the physical pain shooting through his back and ribs. James calmly straightened his uniform and walked over to help the elderly man to his feet, handing him his walking stick with a gentle smile. "Are you all right, sir? Do you need me to call someone for you?" The old man nodded gratefully, his hands shaking as he gripped his walking stick. "Thank you, young man. I'm fine, just a bit shaken up." Marcus was slowly pulling himself up from the floor, his face purple with rage and embarrassment. Several people in the office were openly staring at him now, some even holding up their phones to record what they clearly hoped would be round two of the encounter. The thought of his humiliation being shared on social media made Marcus's anger burn even hotter. "You got lucky," Marcus snarled as he got to his feet, brushing dust and debris from his clothes. "That won't happen again." James turned to face him, his expression still calm and professional. "I'd suggest you leave now, sir, before this gets any worse for you." The warning only inflamed Marcus further. The idea that this ordinary-looking security guard was threatening him, was treating him like some common troublemaker who could be intimidated, was more than his ego could handle. He had spent years building his reputation as someone to be feared, and he wasn't about to let it be destroyed by one lucky throw. "We're not done," Marcus promised as he headed for the door, his voice carrying across the silent office. "I'll be seeing you again real soon." As the glass doors swung shut behind him, Marcus was already planning his revenge. He knew where the security guard worked, and it wouldn't be hard to find out his schedule. Marcus had connections throughout Leeds, people who owed him favors or were too afraid of him to refuse his requests for information. By the end of the week, he would know everything there was to know about James Morrison. What Marcus didn't realize was that his public humiliation had already begun spreading through social media. 3 different people had recorded the incident on their phones, and the videos were being shared across Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with captions like "Bully gets owned by security guard" and "Big man learns not to mess with the wrong person." The irony was that Marcus's reputation, which he had spent years building through fear and intimidation, was about to become his greatest weakness. People who had been terrorized by him for months were finally seeing him as he really was, a coward who could only fight people smaller and weaker than himself. When faced with someone who actually knew how to handle himself, Marcus had been exposed as nothing more than a schoolyard bully in a man's body. But Marcus was too consumed with rage to think clearly about the situation. All he could focus on was the burning humiliation of being thrown around like a child in front of a room full of witnesses. He had built his entire identity around being the strongest, most feared person in any confrontation. Having that identity shattered in a matter of seconds had left him feeling lost and desperate to prove himself again. As he walked through the streets of Leeds that afternoon, Marcus's mind was racing with plans for revenge. He would find James Morrison's address, learn his routine, and wait for the perfect moment to strike back. This time, he would make sure there were no witnesses, no cameras, and no chance for the security guard to get lucky again. This time, Marcus would show him what real violence looked like. The cold November wind cut through his jacket as he made his way back to his flat, but Marcus barely noticed the discomfort. His entire being was focused on one goal: making James Morrison pay for the humiliation he had suffered. He had no way of knowing that his quest for revenge would lead him down a path that would change his life forever, stripping away everything he thought he knew about strength, courage, and what it really meant to be a man. Marcus spent the next 3 days gathering information about James Morrison like a predator studying its prey. His first stop was Tommy Fletcher's auto repair shop in Beeston, where Tommy owed him money from a poker game that had ended badly 6 months earlier. Tommy was a nervous man in his 50s who had made the mistake of trying to bluff Marcus with a pair of sevens and a mortgage payment he couldn't afford to lose. "I need you to find out everything about someone for me," Marcus said without preamble as he walked into the greasy garage. The smell of motor oil and cigarette smoke hung thick in the air, and Tommy nearly dropped the wrench he was holding when he saw who had come to visit. Tommy's hands were shaking as he wiped them on a dirty rag. "Marcus's mate, I told you I'd have your money by Christmas. Things have been slow, but I'm good for it, you know I am." "This isn't about money," Marcus interrupted, his voice cold and businesslike. "I need information about a security guard named James Morrison. Where he lives, where he works, what his schedule looks like." "Think you can handle that?" Tommy nodded eagerly, grateful that this visit wasn't about the £800 he still owed. "Yeah, sure thing. I know a guy who works for one of the security companies. He might be able to help. Give me a day or two." Marcus left his phone number and headed to his next stop, the Crown and Anchor pub in Armley, where his cousin Danny worked as a bartender. Danny was everything Marcus wasn't: small, quick-witted, and smart enough to stay out of trouble. But he was also completely terrified of his larger cousin, which made him useful for gathering information from the pub's regular customers. The Crown and Anchor was the kind of establishment where off-duty police officers drank alongside career criminals, where everyone minded their own business and conversation stopped when strangers walked in. Danny was polishing glasses behind the bar when Marcus arrived, and his face immediately went pale. "All right, Marcus? Haven't seen you in a while. I need you to ask around about someone," Marcus said, sliding onto a bar stool that creaked under his weight. "Security guard, works in the city center, probably drinks somewhere around here. Name's James Morrison." Danny's nervousness increased. He knew his cousin well enough to recognize the tone that meant someone was about to get hurt badly. "What's this about, then?" "That's not your concern. Just find out what you can and call me when you have something useful." Marcus left the pub and spent the rest of the evening walking through Leeds city center, paying particular attention to the government buildings and offices where private security firms typically worked. He noted the locations of cameras, the timing of police patrols, and the flow of pedestrian traffic at different hours. If he was going to confront James Morrison again, he wanted to choose the time and place carefully. By Thursday afternoon, both Tommy and Danny had called with information. Tommy's contact at the security company had confirmed that James Morrison worked for Elite Protection Services, a firm that provided security for several government buildings in Leeds. He typically worked the day shift at various locations, but his primary assignment was the Department for Work and Pensions building on Wellington Street, just a few blocks from where their first encounter had taken place. Danny's information was even more valuable. He had spoken to a regular customer who worked as a cleaner in the DWP building, and she had mentioned that the tall security guard usually took his lunch break at a small cafe called Maggie's Kitchen on Boar Lane. He typically arrived around 12:30 and stayed for about 30 minutes, always sitting at the same table near the window where he could keep an eye on the street. Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction as he processed this information. James Morrison was a creature of habit, which made him predictable and vulnerable. The cafe was perfect for what Marcus had in mind: busy enough that he could blend in until the right moment, but not so crowded that he would have trouble making his escape afterward. Friday morning found Marcus sitting in his flat, staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. His face was still swollen and bruised from where it had hit the floor during their first encounter, and the reminder of his humiliation made his anger burn even hotter. He had spent the previous night drinking and reliving the moment when James had thrown him across the room like he weighed nothing. The memory made him sick with rage and shame. Marcus had always prided himself on being unstoppable in a fight. He had never met anyone who could match his size and strength, never encountered someone who wasn't intimidated by his physical presence. The fact that James Morrison had not only stood up to him but had effortlessly defeated him challenged everything Marcus believed about himself and his place in the world. As he got dressed, Marcus mentally rehearsed his plan. He would arrive at Maggie's Kitchen around noon and take a table where he could watch for James's arrival. When the security guard showed up for his regular lunch break, Marcus would wait until he was seated and comfortable before making his move. This time, he would be ready for any fancy fighting techniques. This time, he would use his size and weight to overwhelm James before the smaller man could react. The knife felt heavy in his jacket pocket as Marcus walked through the city center toward Boar Lane. He had taken it from his kitchen that morning, a 6-inch carving blade that his mother had used to prepare Sunday roasts when he was a child. Marcus told himself it was just for intimidation, a way to make sure James understood how serious he was about getting his revenge. But, deep down, he knew that his anger had progressed beyond the point where he could guarantee his own self-control. Maggie's kitchen was exactly what Marcus had expected, a small, cozy cafe with mismatched chairs and the kind of homemade comfort food that attracted office workers looking for a break from their sterile corporate environments. The walls were covered with local artwork and old photographs of Leeds, and the smell of fresh bread and coffee filled the air. Marcus ordered a cup of tea and a sandwich he had no intention of eating, then settled into a corner table where he could observe the entire cafe without being obvious about it. He checked his watch, 12:15. If Danny's information was correct, James would arrive within the next 20 minutes. As Marcus waited, he found himself studying the other customers. There was an elderly couple sharing a piece of cake, a young mother trying to keep her toddler entertained while she ate a salad, and several office workers hunched over their phones while they consumed quick lunches. None of them looked like they would interfere if things got violent, which was exactly what Marcus wanted. At 12:28, James Morrison walked through the cafe's front door. Marcus felt his heart rate increase as he watched his target survey the room, looking for an empty table. James was wearing his security uniform and had the same calm, professional demeanor that had so infuriated Marcus during their first encounter. There was nothing in his body language to suggest he was aware of any danger or that he remembered their previous confrontation as anything more than a minor workplace incident. James chose a table near the window, just as Danny's source had predicted. He hung his jacket on the back of his chair and picked up a menu, seemingly oblivious to the fact that his movements were being tracked by someone who was planning to hurt him very badly. Marcus waited until James had ordered his food and was settled comfortably in his chair before making his move. He stood up slowly, his massive frame casting a shadow across the small cafe, and began walking toward James's table. Several other customers glanced up at him, perhaps sensing the tension in his movements or noticing the predatory focus in his eyes. James looked up from his phone as Marcus approached, and there was a moment of recognition in his expression. But, instead of fear or concern, James simply nodded politely and returned his attention to his device, as if Marcus was just another customer walking past his table. The casual dismissal was like gasoline on the fire of Marcus's rage. How dare this man ignore him? How dare he act like their previous encounter was insignificant? Marcus had spent 3 days planning his revenge, and James was treating him like he was invisible. "Remember me?" Marcus asked, stopping directly beside James's table. His voice was loud enough to carry across the small cafe, causing conversations to stop and heads to turn in their direction. James looked up again, this time maintaining eye contact. "Of course. You're the gentleman from the unemployment office. How are you doing?" The polite, professional tone made Marcus's anger spike even higher. He had expected fear, or at least acknowledgement of the threat he represented. Instead, James was speaking to him like he was a customer service representative dealing with a mildly irritating complaint. "I think we have some unfinished business," Marcus said, his hand moving instinctively toward the pocket where the knife was hidden. "You embarrassed me the other day." James set down his phone and gave Marcus his full attention. "I'm sorry you feel that way. I was just doing my job, making sure everyone in the office was safe. There's no need for any hard feelings." The apologetic response only infuriated Marcus further. He wanted confrontation, wanted the chance to prove his dominance and restore his damaged reputation. James's calm professionalism was robbing him of the satisfaction he craved, making him feel even more powerless and frustrated than he had before. Other customers were beginning to notice the tension at James's table. The young mother was gathering up her toddler's toys, preparing to leave quickly. The elderly couple had stopped eating and were looking around nervously, as if trying to decide whether to call for help or simply flee. Marcus leaned down, placing both hands on James's table and bringing his face close to the security guards. "You think you're better than me? Think you can just throw me around and walk away like nothing happened?" James remained seated, his expression calm but alert. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. You were aggressive toward an elderly man, and I responded appropriately. That's all there was to it. Appropriately? Marcus's voice was rising now, drawing attention from everyone in the cafe. You humiliated me in front of all those people. You made me look like a fool. You did that yourself, James said quietly, but firmly. I just made sure you couldn't hurt anyone else. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. The truth in them was undeniable, which made them even harder to accept. He had humiliated himself by attacking someone weaker than him. He had made himself look like a fool by losing his temper over such a trivial incident. But, admitting that truth would mean accepting responsibility for his actions, something Marcus had never been willing to do. The cafe had gone completely silent now. Everyone was watching the confrontation, waiting to see what would happen next. Some customers had their phones out, ready to record whatever unfolded. Others were quietly gathering their belongings, preparing to leave if the situation escalated further. Marcus straightened up and reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers closing around the handle of the carving knife. The weight of it felt reassuring in his hand, a reminder of the ultimate authority that came with being willing to use violence when others weren't. This was where his true power lay, in his willingness to cross lines that civilized people wouldn't cross. Stand up, Marcus commanded, his voice low and threatening. We're going outside to finish this properly. James remained seated, but his posture had shifted slightly. To most observers, he still looked relaxed and non-threatening. But someone with military training would have recognized the subtle changes, the way his weight was now distributed on the balls of his feet, the positioning of his hands for maximum mobility, the angle of his shoulders that suggested coiled energy ready to be released. I don't think that's necessary, James said. Why don't you sit down, and we can talk about whatever's bothering you like civilized adults. The suggestion that he should sit down and talk like a civilized adult was the final insult Marcus could endure. In his mind, James was treating him like a child having a tantrum, like someone who could be managed and controlled through patience and reason. The condescension was unbearable. Marcus pulled the knife from his pocket, holding it low against his leg where most of the other customers couldn't see it clearly. But James saw it immediately, his eyes flicking down to assess the weapon and then back up to Marcus's face. For the first time since the confrontation began, something changed in James's expression. That's a mistake, James said, his voice still calm but carrying a new edge of authority. Put that away and walk out of here. This doesn't have to end badly for you. Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction at finally seeing something like concern in James's demeanor. This was more like it. This was the respect he deserved. Too late for that, he said, raising the knife so that James could see it clearly. You should have thought about the consequences before you decided to make me look like a fool. What Marcus didn't realize was that several customers had already seen the weapon and were calling the police on their phones. He was so focused on his confrontation with James that he had lost awareness of everything else happening around him. His tunnel vision, which he thought of as intense focus, was actually one of his greatest weaknesses. James stood up slowly, his movements careful and controlled. There are innocent people in here, he said, gesturing slightly toward the young mother who was now holding her toddler protectively. Whatever issue you have is with me, not them. Let's take this outside. Marcus grinned, thinking he had finally gained the upper hand. James was offering to go outside, which meant he was scared of the knife and trying to minimize the damage. What Marcus failed to understand was that James was thinking tactically, trying to move the confrontation away from civilians who could be hurt in the crossfire. Now you want to go outside? Marcus laughed harshly. After acting like you were too good to fight me? Afraid I might cut you up in front of all these nice people? James began moving toward the door, his movements slow and non-threatening. Come on, then. Let's settle this once and for all. Marcus followed, keeping the knife visible as a reminder of the power dynamic he believed had shifted in his favor. He was so focused on maintaining his intimidating presence that he failed to notice the way James was positioning himself, creating distance and angles that would matter once they were outside. As they walked toward the cafe's exit, Marcus was already savoring his anticipated victory. This time, there would be no lucky throws or fancy martial arts techniques. This time, he had the ultimate equalizer in his hand, and James Morrison would learn what happened to people who tried to make Marcus Thompson look like a fool. The afternoon air was cold against their faces as they stepped out onto Boar Lane. The street was moderately busy with office workers and shoppers, but not crowded enough to provide much protection for James if things went badly. Marcus positioned himself between James and the cafe door, cutting off his retreat route. "Last chance to apologize," Marcus said, holding the knife where passing pedestrians could see it. Several people had already noticed the weapon and were crossing to the other side of the street or ducking into nearby shops. "Get on your knees and tell me you're sorry for humiliating me." James shook his head. "I'm not going to do that. And I'm going to ask you one more time to put that knife away and walk away from this." Marcus's grin widened. "Or what? You'll throw me around again? Let's see how that works out when I'm the one with the weapon." What happened next would be analyzed and debated by self-defense experts and military veterans for months afterward. James's response to Marcus's knife attack was a masterclass in close-quarters combat, a demonstration of training and experience that went far beyond anything a typical security guard would possess. But, in that moment, as Marcus lunged forward with the carving knife aimed at James's chest, all he was thinking about was the satisfaction of finally proving his superiority over the man who had humiliated him. He had no idea that his quest for revenge was about to teach him a lesson about the difference between being big and being dangerous, between intimidating civilians and facing someone who had been trained to fight for their life. The knife thrust that Marcus thought would end the confrontation in his favor never reached its target. As he lunged forward with all his weight behind the blade, James moved with the fluid precision of someone who had faced life-or-death situations far more dangerous than a street fight with an angry bully. James stepped inside Marcus's attack range, deflecting the knife-wielding arm while simultaneously driving his elbow into Marcus's solar plexus with surgical precision. The blow knocked the wind out of Marcus's lungs and sent him stumbling backward, gasping for air like a fish pulled from water. But James wasn't finished. Before Marcus could recover, James had grabbed his wrist and twisted it with a motion that seemed effortless but generated tremendous force. The carving knife clattered to the pavement as Marcus felt something pop in his wrist, followed by a wave of pain that made his vision blur. He tried to swing his free hand at James, but his target seemed to anticipate the movement, ducking under the wild punch and responding with a precise strike to Marcus's knee that sent him crashing to the ground. The entire exchange had lasted less than 10 seconds, but, to the witnesses gathering on Boar Lane, it seemed like they had watched a master craftsman dismantling a piece of broken machinery. There was no wasted motion in James's movements, no unnecessary force or dramatic flourishes. He had simply neutralized the threat with the minimum amount of violence required. Marcus found himself face down on the cold pavement, his right wrist throbbing with pain and his knee refusing to support his weight properly. The humiliation was even worse than the physical discomfort. Once again, James Morrison had made him look like an amateur, like a big, clumsy child pretending to be dangerous. "Stay down," James said firmly, placing one foot on Marcus's back to keep him from getting up. "The police are on their way." Marcus could hear sirens in the distance, growing louder as they approached. He tried to push himself up with his good hand, but James applied just enough pressure to keep him pinned without causing additional injury. The casual ease with which the smaller man controlled him was perhaps the most humiliating aspect of the entire encounter. "You don't know who you're messing with," Marcus gasped, his face pressed against the dirty pavement. "I've got friends in this city. People who won't let this slide." James's voice remained calm and professional. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. You're a bully who thinks size makes you tough. But you've never faced anyone who actually knows how to fight." The crowd of onlookers was growing larger as news of the confrontation spread through social media. Several people were recording the scene on their phones, and Marcus could hear them discussing what they had witnessed. The words "absolutely destroyed" and "never seen anything like it" reached his ears, adding to his shame and rage. When the police arrived, they found James standing calmly beside Marcus, who was still face down on the pavement with his hands visible and non-threatening. The knife was several feet away, clearly marking it as evidence of Marcus's aggressive intent. Sergeant Patricia Wells was the first officer on the scene, and she immediately recognized the controlled, professional demeanor of someone with military or law enforcement training. James's posture, his positioning relative to the suspect, and his obvious restraint in dealing with a much larger opponent all suggested experience beyond what a typical security guard would possess. "I'm Sergeant Wells, West Yorkshire Police," she announced as she approached. "Can you tell me what happened here?" James stepped back, allowing the officers to take control of Marcus while keeping his own hands visible and open. "This gentleman approached me in the cafe and became increasingly aggressive. When we came outside, he produced a knife and attempted to attack me. I defended myself using minimal necessary force." Marcus tried to contradict the account, but his protests were undermined by the testimony of multiple witnesses and the video evidence that several bystanders had captured on their phones. The footage clearly showed him displaying the knife and initiating the attack, making it impossible for him to claim self-defense. As the paramedics examined his injuries, Marcus began to understand the severity of his situation. His wrist was definitely broken, requiring immediate medical attention and, potentially, surgery to repair properly. His knee had been damaged in a way that would probably require months of physical therapy. But, worse than the physical injuries was the recognition that his reputation as a dangerous man was now